We're recording this session because we're posting all of our workshops on our YouTube channel, and we'll send a link to that in follow-up materials. I guess I should say we are here to talk about how to fund community housing. That is the topic for today. There are some topics that might be that we might be glossing over because we cover them in other sessions. So if you would like to have a refresher on most things affordable housing or housing development related, I would encourage you to visit our YouTube channel to look at our Housing 101 workshop that we did last month. That you can stream that for free on our YouTube channel, and we'll include that link, like I said. So today, today's session is part of the CDP's Lower Cape Housing Institute. This is almost a year long, 9 months of programming that we offer every year, targeted primarily for town officials and town staff, but we have been opening up these sessions to other people who might consider themselves to be housing advocates. And this is our second workshop in this year's Lower Cape Housing Institute. At the end of the session, we'll talk about what's coming up next. So today's session is really talking about how to fund community housing. Obviously, the need for community housing has been coming up in conversations more and more over the past few years, I'd say, as towns try to grapple with the housing crisis and its effects on people with more moderate incomes. This lack of housing for people with what most of us would consider to be really good paying jobs is actually not unique to the Cape. It's a national problem as well. And the challenge is that the primary funding sources for affordable housing development do not apply to the creation of community housing largely. So our towns need to get really creative with securing less restricted funding that can be used to create the housing that we all need in our communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura Schufelt. Laura is the Director of Community Assistance at Massachusetts Housing Partnership, who we collaborate with extensively, and Laura will be covering topics and also introducing you to some panelists that will be joining us in a bit. Turn it over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. As Andrea said, I am the Director of Community Assistance at MHP. And for those of you, I think I know a lot of you, but I don't know everybody. So I'll give you just a brief. I am a Cape Cod native. I still live on the Cape. And when our office is open, I work in Boston. But that hasn't happened for since March of 2020. So I'm working from home, which is great. I will apologize in advance if you can hear the chipper that has decided to be cutting trees and chipping in my front yard, well, on the road in front of my house. But I don't think you can hear it, I hope. I'm going to share my screen and get going. Let's see, there we go. Okay, can someone give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Belinda, yes, good. I don't want to do that. Okay. All right, so as Andrea said, we are talking about how to fund community housing. So the first thing I will do is give you a brief introduction to MHP. We have a recent mission statement change, so I will read that. MHP works with communities to create innovative policy and financing solutions that provide affordable homes and better lives for the people of Massachusetts. And we do that in a number of ways. We finance affordable rental housing at rates and terms that are better than conventional and usually better than other affordable options. We have a first-time homebuyer program called One Mortgage that has been rated the most affordable first-time homebuyer program that is out there. We have the Center for Housing Data, which provides housing data to back up policy for the administration and for MHP. And lastly, we have the community assistance team. We provide direct technical assistance to municipalities, housing authorities, and nonprofits. We have small grant programs to support trainings, third-party technical assistance, and nonprofit collaboration. We host workshops and trainings, and like this, participate in others trainings. We have a 40B technical assistant grant program, which provides consultants to ZBAs to help them work through any 40B projects that are before them. And that is non-competitive. Everyone who asks gets it. We have publications on how to do a lot of things in affordable housing and special initiatives and policy. Right now, we're working on a transit-oriented development capital program and technical assistance program. I'm also working on public land disposition issues and also looking at wastewater and wastewater regulations and I can't think of what I'm trying to say. Anyway, wastewater regulations that go beyond the state's Title V that can be a barrier to housing throughout the state. So how to fund community housing? The first thing we got to do is talk about what is community housing. There's not a single definition, but it generally refers to housing that's restricted or targeted to households earning above the defined affordable housing limit of 80% of area median income. So if you're doing a community housing program, who decides what that income limit can be? Sometimes it's funding sources. If you need subsidy from the state, they will decide what the limits are going to be. Local communities can do it with some input, and we'll talk about communities that have defined community housing above 80%. And sometimes it goes to the legislature if a town is looking at a home rule petition in order to get their definition of community housing, get it stamped with of approval from the state. So we talk of, there's different terms to talk about housing, and I wanted to just kind of talk about the differences in the terms. Affordable housing with a capital A qualifies for subsidized housing inventory. That's the 10% count that the state keeps. It's also to qualify for most state and federal affordable housing funds. The maximum household income is 80% of median income. To give you an idea of what that means in Barnstable County, for one person, it would be $54,450. For two, it's $62,200. And then I'll skip to four is $77,750. So that's what 80% is. That's the capital A affordable limits. Community housing. As I said, there's various defined income limits up to 200% of AMI. And for 200% of AMI, to give you just a brief numbers, for one person, it's about 125,000. For two people, it's 142,000. And for four people, it is just under 180,000. But besides those various income limits, it can also refer to no income limits if it's in response to a severe lack of, and I used attainable, sometimes use attainable versus community, attainable homes. So if there's no rental property or home ownership property or available property, we can call it, it would be community housing without any income limits. And then my least favorite term, workforce housing. When used in mass housing programs, household income up to 120% of area median income. But some folks use it as anything above 80%. So kind of interchangeable with community. So how do local communities, how do our our local communities to find community housing. We have a couple people who are going to say how their towns on the Lower Cape and the islands have defined community housing. First up, I'm going to call on Michelle Jarosevich from the town of Provincetown. Hey, Michelle, you want to unmute yourself?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Jarosevich, and I'm the Community Housing Specialist for the town of Provincetown. I have worked for the town for about 37 years, various capacities, but I have done the housing for, I think, just a little over 10. So back in 2015, the idea of tackling this category actually came from the Finance Committee, and they brought forward a special legislation article at town meeting that read quite different than how it ended up. But everyone had acknowledged by that point that we needed to go beyond your traditional affordable housing. We've been tackling the traditional affordable housing since 1997, coming up with all different kinds of programs and developments and everything, but it's still not enough. And what we found was that there's so many people, especially if you had a couple or a family, that were not eligible for your traditional affordable housing, because to survive down here, you need to have 2 or 3 jobs and work your butt off to get by. And so those people who are doing those little extra jobs in the summer or on the weekends or whatever would often be just a little over the eligibility lines. And the people who manage or own businesses, but were renters, were never eligible either. And the fact that that rentals in general were just evaporating as far as availability. So we had the 2 issues: eligibility and access to homes. So from that, the Finance Committee put forward not only an article for the special legislation, but also a request for $1 million in seed money. And town meeting approved both, years before it all happened. And then the following year, they voted again in 2016 to submit the special legislation, because we're on the cutting edge. It always takes a couple times, and another $500,000 at that point. So the legislation that was submitted mirrors your traditional affordable housing trust with a few tweaks. The biggest one being, of course, the area median income eligibility up to 200% area median income. So that was the biggest one, but a lot of the other parts were quite similar to your traditional affordable housing trust, which we also have. It created the Provincetown Year-Round Market Rate Rental Trust entity, which has a lot of authority. It's still a town entity, so we do have to follow municipal regulations, especially procurement, which is a challenge. But so we already have a community housing council that is the gatekeeper for your traditional affordable housing trust fund. And we also have a housing authority. So we have 3 housing entities in town. The Year-Round Market Rate Trust, just at the same time as the governor signed the special legislation, we became aware of an opportunity to acquire a former timeshare condominium resort called Harbor Hill. Had 26 units that was in bankruptcy. And town meeting showed up for February 2017, single item warrant. And I can tell you it was the biggest crowd that ever showed up to any town meeting in all my years. The lines went around the block, and this was February, where we weren't sure, how many people would even be here. But not without debate, but it was overwhelming approval of a $10.7 million bond to both acquire the property and to do some renovations. So then we moved forward, and it took a lot longer than we thought. What was the acquisition we thought would be a couple months was a year and a half. It cost us more money than we thought, of course, and had its other bumps and bruises, in part because we're a municipality doing things that we don't normally do. So we were kind of recreating the wheel, mirroring our traditional affordable housing processes and stuff. But it was all town money, so it had a less fine point things that usually go along with your tax credits and all those other processes. So we did acquire the property. We also got in that time frame a $250,000 grant from the Housing Choice Program, which allowed us to convert a couple spaces that were like an office and a storage space into accessible units within the footprint of the existing buildings. And so we went from 26 units to 28 units. They're in 4 separate buildings, and one building came online where the renovations bidding went sideways. We got no bids really the first time. Second time we got a lot higher than we expected. So we did some of the renovations in-house, and then went to the bigger project, and we were at full occupancy a year ago, October of 2020. So all 28 units are occupied and moving along. We're continuing to do small renovations, replacements, because we did not replace everything. And where the building sat empty a couple of years, the appliances and the windows and doors and all those things, we're continuing to replace as we go. And now, as far as the new short-term rental tax, the town of Provincetown many years.
Michelle, can I just
Yep.
cut you
Sure,
there?
stop me. Yep.
All right, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The
Okay.
short-term rental. Okay?
Okay.
Thanks.
That
Thank
was
you,
it
that
for
was
my
great.
trusting. Okay.
Thanks. Next, I'm going to ask Katie Donovan from the town of Chatham.
Thank you, Laura.
Can you
So-
talk about the trust?
Yes, I will. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. So Chatham is in a little bit of a different place. We are in the process of trying to create the framework in order to be able to fund community housing. What we have done, after approval at our annual town meeting in June, we filed 3 home rule petitions. The first one is basically to create the framework, and that's to create a one housing trust that will allow for 2 funding sources, if you will, for both affordable and what we call in Chatham attainable housing. The idea is that in our definition of attainable housing would be up to 200% of area median income. And so the idea is to, again, first lay the groundwork so that we can create create that trust that would allow us to work on and fund projects in that way. The other 2 home rule petitions that were filed are in hopes of creating funding sources. And so one was a real estate transfer fee for properties in excess of $2 million. And the other was suggested by one of our select board members, and it was to ask if we're in specifically to Chatham, to be able to use CPC funds, CPA funds for housing projects up to 200% area median income to help us to fund this need. So again, we are just recently the Joint Committee on Revenue held their initial hearing on the real estate property transfer fee. And then last week, the Joint Committee on Housing actually held the hearing on the other 2, the trust article, as well as the CPA. And we were able to provide testimony at those, both written and verbal testimony. So understanding, though, that we don't necessarily want to, we can't wait for for those to pass just to be able to move forward with housing initiatives. We had issued an RFP for the purchase of private property and ended up getting 2 responses. One of those, we do have a deal with the property owners that's taking some time to work out for issues on their end, but we are still in the process. We have a signed purchase and sale agreement, And our town meeting actually voted to fund that purchase of that property for 50% from our Affordable Housing Trust and then 50% from our free cash, so that we could fund the project for, again, it will be 50% affordable and then 50% attainable. So looking, to potentially create that model again, moving forward. But again, just understanding that we're just in the beginning stages of creating the framework. So
Thanks, Katie. Do you know what the process is going forward? You said you've been before 2 committees.
We have been. And so my understanding, what I've been trying to find out is that, the next steps for the legislation, my understanding is that there needs to be a decision made, or they have to, at least there has to be some sort of ruling before February 2nd is my understanding. And so I don't know how long, the process will take. I know it can take years. So we'll just continue to, sit tight and hopefully be receive notice from Representative Peake's office at the various junctions throughout the process.
Thanks, Katie. That was great. And next, I want to call on Tucker Holland from Nantucket.
Thanks, Laura. Pleasure to be here today with you all. I'm Tucker Holland. I'm the housing director for Nantucket. One of the beautiful things about going last in the panel is the first to cover a lot of the background and give great examples. So I can be relatively short and sweet, I hope. We define community housing here on Nantucket through our Affordable Housing Trust as up to 200% AMI. We are a big believer in mixed income projects. Basically, everything that we support involves housing that serves a variety of income levels. And we have positioned the trust as the central funding mechanism for all housing activities on the island. So we do have several different agencies that deal with housing, a local housing authority. We have Housing Nantucket, a private nonprofit organization, Habitat for Humanity, and basically all funding is channeled through the trust. So the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. We're making sure that we are serving a variety of income levels and different types of housing in terms of rental and ownership in what we direct project funding to. And I'll get into that a little bit more, I think, under a different segment of the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Tucker. Most agree that in order to have a formal definition that's above 80 or 100% really for a trust, that you have to use a home rule petition, which is what Provincetown used and Katie is using and trying to do in Chatham. And Tucker, I can't remember if you used a home rule petition or you just defined it.
We defined it under, low and moderate as up to 200.
Okay. In the statute for the trust funds, it doesn't define the limits. It just says low and moderate. Okay, thanks for that. So I'm going to move on. Still talking about definitions. Topic for discussion: why do we dislike the term workforce housing? I have my own opinions, but I'd love to hear from other folks if they dislike the term as much as I do. Raise your hand if you want to comment. If nobody commenting. Tucker?
I just simply would say I agree with you. We try not to use the word workforce. It excludes a large part, in a way, of the population that we're trying to serve.
Thanks. Alan, I see your hand up. Can you unmute?
I believe, and Laura has been around long enough to remember, that this was a term that was introduced by DHCD about 30 years ago, or maybe 35. I try to remember the secretary at the time, but it was a way to get away from low-income housing. And so they came up with workforce, undefined, but it was a good catchword at the time.
I think it was Mary Padula.
Right, okay.
That's aging me, sorry.
Yeah.
Harry, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm relatively new to this, but at least in Wellfleet, the lack of housing for our workforce is a very visible fact, and it's reflected in, reduced hours at restaurants, failure to staff the deli counter at the local marketplace, reduced hours at coffee shops. So it's a very visible problem, and it's a useful label for that. I recognize that it does not include things like housing for other age groups, but I'm not sure I attach as much of a pejorative meaning to it as some others.
Okay. Jay?
So, often we're using this term to refer to housing for people above 80% of area median income. And the fact is that if you work full-time, 40 hours a week, 52 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and are being paid minimum wage, you're going to earn $31,200, which almost gets you into 30% of AMI units. And so why I don't like the term workforce housing, particularly when it's used to describe folks above 80% of AMI, is that it suggests that so many of our residents who are living in traditional affordable housing don't work, and that's why they're there. When in fact they do work, they work really hard. They just work in jobs that don't provide a living wage.
Thanks, Jay. That's absolutely the reasons that I balk at the term, because it usually refers to above 80%, and that really doesn't reflect our workforce on the Cape, at least in my opinion. So I'm going to move on. What term resonates with folks in your community? Is it community housing? Is it affordable housing? Is it attainable housing? Is it available housing? Or what doesn't resonate? Anybody? No, I think low income doesn't resonate, in my opinion. Carolyn, did you want to speak? Can't tell you.
Sure, I'm sorry. I can't figure out how to technically wave my hand other than waving it. So anyways, just about to speak to the workforce housing, I personally hate that term. I understand how it came about. It was trying to address a specific demographic. But in addition to the point that Jay made about it kind of insinuating that people below that aren't working, it's just the class distinction of we're workers and we serve a purpose, so we get housing. I find it very insulting, and if you don't, I don't know, it's just a classification of that. If you can prove that you're worthy, then maybe they'll give you housing. And I personally take offense to it, but I understand it's trying to differentiate between the AMIs, and there is a selling point to that. I know when I go out and advocate for housing, one of the big points that we make at this point is, don't you want people in your community to have these jobs and to serve the community so that we're functioning a town? So that there is an argument there, but I don't like it being the label anyways. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Andrea?
Yeah, I would agree with Carolyn. I think one of the reasons why community housing works so well is because when you're using different terms, you're being really specific about who is or is not deserving of the housing. And it's irrelevant, frankly, because towns have housing needs that cross a bunch of different incomes, and we just need to prioritize developing those units. How those units get funding is something that kind of happens on the back end. That doesn't need to be part of the community discussion around who should or should not have housing.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to move on. So I'm going to talk about where there are funding sources for community housing, and what those are, and if they, now these, I'll get into the details. Some of this community housing does have limits, most of them above 80%. So on the federal side, there's a new homeownership assistance fund, which of course everyone's calling HALF. So, which is really confusing to me, but anyway, it will be administered by MHP, and probably not been very public yet, but you know, I'm an insider, so I can tell you. It's a federal program. Massachusetts is kind of leading the charge and getting things up and running. It probably will be operational in December, hopefully before the first of the year. It will assist homeowners up to 150% of AMI, and it will work kind of like a foreclosure assistance, deterrence fund to bring folks up to current on their mortgages. I don't have all the details yet because they haven't all been worked out, but that's something that you should know is being assembled now and will be available in the near future. Federal funds for the state, the ARPA funds, the latest on the ARPA funds that I could find was the House recommendations. I'm not sure the Senate has recommended. And their recommended amounts for housing is quite a bit lower than what the governor had indicated he wanted to do on his own, and then went to the legislature. So they've allocated 150 million, or they're proposed to allocate 150 million for supportive housing. That is most likely in response to homelessness. And so that would not be community, it's still community housing because community housing is the full range, but it would most likely have income limits. 150 million for public housing maintenance. The language on that hasn't come out yet. If it includes redevelopment of public housing, the redevelopment that is happening is a replacement of the public housing, and then additional units that would be a range of income. So typically they go from the public housing range, and then they'll go from 80 to even market. Several of the redevelopment programs have market. So that has a possibility to do a broader range where there is public housing. $100 million for homeowner assistance, and that's basically first-time homeowner assistance, and it would include down payment assistance and an amendment that MHP supported got passed that would allow some of those funds to be used for debt reduction, including student loan reduction, which in some cases is more beneficial than down payment assistance because it allows first-time home buyers to be eligible for mortgages. $100 million for Commonwealth Builder Program. This is a homeowner development program run through Mass Housing. Right now, the administration has a strict definition of who can, in what communities this can be used. But we're hearing from our colleagues in other states that they use a much broader definition. So the definition the state right now administration is looking at is gateway cities and what are called qualified census tracts, which are low income tracts. And so that really limits who could use it. And that Commonwealth Builders Program goes up to 120% of AMI. And $100 million for affordable housing production preservation is on rental, and that would be limited to the other programs that I'll be talking about, the state programs. federal funds to communities and counties. I haven't heard of any of the federal CARES funds going for housing on the Cape. It is across the state, and I know the county divvied it up without using housing. I'm wondering if any of the towns represented here has used CARES funds for housing. Jay?
At a select board meeting in Provincetown a couple of weeks ago, the town manager announced that the town would be putting its, I think it's approximately 300,000 in CARES Act money into the housing trust.
Great, thank you. I hadn't seen that. Harry?
Yes, and the Wellfleet Select Board voted to allocate the remaining CARES funding, which I think is $146,000 this year and $146,000 next year, also for housing purposes. No
Awesome.
specific details yet, but
Great. Great. Has anyone done any advocacy or talked to anyone at the county about using the funds? Besides me? The county has $34 million. So anyone who wants to chime in, look at your county commissioners. All right, so those are the federal funds, not too much available there, but the opportunity for some funds in the future. State funds, the State Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is run through Mass Housing, goes up to 110% of AMI. That's a fund for rental housing. It actually can be used for home ownership as well, and can fill, basically it's a development subsidy, so it fills the gap in the construction. Mass Housing's workforce housing, let's say housing, is up to 120%. We talked about that before. That provides $100,000 per unit for units that are between 80 and 120%. Elaine, do you have a question?
Yes, and if not now, afterwards, could you also give us the incomes for 110% and 120%? Because sometimes it seems challenging to find those.
Yes, and I'll just make a quick note on that, is that HUD has changed some of the calculations, so they're not, you can't do a straight calculation off of 100% anymore, and so makes it challenging. And but I do have those numbers. So all right, so the workforce housing, Commonwealth Builders, we talked about up to 120%. One of the issues with the workforce housing, Mass Housing's workforce housing, and some of the other programs as well, state programs, is that they require the above 80% units to be priced at 10% below the market rate, which then limits the household income to the corresponding AMI. For example, if market translates to 90% AMI, which it did in the Eastham project, the eligibility is locked at 90% AMI for households, even though the definition allows eligibility up to 120%. Should this be changed in areas of limited attainable or available housing? Should it be changed so that if the rents need to be restricted, can the eligibility be restricted, or should it all be open? Jay?
I would just share with you, Laura, that the Community Development Partnership is working with Preservation of Affordable Housing, and as proposed, is one of the developers on the Lawrence Road project in Wellfleet. And we actually, after a very thoughtful analysis, decided not to use the Mass Housing Workforce Fund, specifically because of this dynamic that played out in Eastham, where you basically ended up, those units were capped at 90% of AMI and went up to 120% of AMI. And so what was our feeling on that project, that we could finance it in other ways and broaden the above 80% area median income to pretty much make it unlimited, and have it be kind of what we negotiated eventually with the town of what would make sense.
Thanks. Yeah, I was really, I didn't realize they were going to do that in the Eastham project, and neither, I think, did the developers. And so they were looking at revenue of 120% rents, and then, had to fill a gap because of this rule. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this? Seeing none. All right, I will move on. So now really the meat of this discussion, local funds for community housing. We all know that community preservation funds can fund up to 100% of AMI. It can be bonded for greater impact. I'm not going to go into great detail about how that is done because MHP, working with the Community Preservation Coalition, is going to have a training specifically on bonding CPA for housing in the early winter. I don't have a date yet, but my colleague Shelley Goring will be leading that, and she's hoping to have a date set relatively soon. But I can tell you that many towns have bonded in order to make greater purchases or the greater impact with their funds. So next up, I want folks to talk about how their towns are using or are trying to use short-term rental fees funds to fund community housing. And first off, I'm going to ask Harry Tarkadian, who's the chair of the Wellfleet Trust, to talk to us about their reasoning and request that's in. Harry,
Thanks, Laura. Just before I do that, very quickly, there actually are 5 separate pieces to the short-term rental tax, and they break down. The Commonwealth gets currently 5.7%. That goes directly to the Commonwealth. We don't see it. Towns are allowed a local option of up to 6%. And then there's a third tax of 2.75% that goes to the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund to deal with nitrogen loading on Cape Cod. And then there are 2 other pieces, a community impact fee of up to 3% that can be imposed on essentially on professionally managed units. It requires a separate town meeting vote. It's limited to up to 3%, and a minimum of 35% of that slice of the revenue has to be devoted to, quote, affordable housing or local infrastructure. And then there's a 5th tax, which is on owner-occupied 2 and 3 unit properties that follows the same kind of rules as the community impact fee. So right now, Wellfleet is, this January 1st, will be at 6% on the base local tax, the one that applies to everybody. We started a discussion with the select board back in March, and this September, we made a formal request to them for a policy allocating or designating 80% of the town of Wellfleet receipts from the tax on short-term rentals to the Affordable Housing Trust for creation, preservation, and support of housing. It was favorably received by the select board when we discussed it in March, and again when we discussed it this fall. I think that we also have support within the Finance Committee. I'm not sure that their support extends to 80% of the fund. And what's sort of tempered the process is 2 things. One of them is the pretty widely known accounting deficiencies that Wellfleet is working its way through. And it's unclear whether there will be a couple of holes in the dike that have to be filled from extraordinary sources, some of which could be this fund. And the second is that as with any new source of funding, there is some competition for the fund. In particular, the wastewater, the people working on wastewater have at least made it known they feel that they're entitled to some consideration. They haven't taken a formal position. The basics of the argument that we made to the select board has been, first of all, that there is, Wellfleet has a housing problem that extends beyond big A affordable housing. And I think that that's not unique to Wellfleet, but it's very common to our local region. And that there's much less available in the way of state and federal support for housing that's not big A housing. So we need to find a revenue source to support that effort. And at least in Wellfleet, approximately 2/3 of the single family residences are seasonal properties. And as a result, they are typically no longer available for year-round rentals or even for winter rentals anymore. So the argument is that the economic factors that make it very attractive to use a second home as a summer rental, 2 or 3 weeks for the owner type use, is much more financially beneficial to the owner. So they disappear from the housing market. And it struck us, we made the pitch that it's fair that the use of these properties for vacation rentals is a contributing factor to the housing problem. So the revenue derived from that activity should be committed to a large degree to support alleviating the problem. And I'm not trying to demonize short-term rental owners. It's financially, you can't argue with the way the numbers work out. But the argument has been, it's a new source of funding, so it hasn't been committed to other general budget purposes. And two, it's tied directly to an activity which is a significant contributor to the housing shortage. And so we're still, the process is still ongoing. We aren't at the finish line yet. We don't know whether we will end up with 80% or 50% or a slice of pizza. Who knows? But we're optimistic that we have traction and that we have an argument that resonates in the community. That's basically where we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. That was great. I want to just share Brewster's policy, which they passed in May. It's actually quite a long policy, but I just pulled out the expenditures. And I thought that the purpose, if you read the whole policy, is terrific around, the language is terrific around supporting affordable housing. But the expenditures, and indulge me while I read this, the town is committed to establishing a permanent funding mechanism to support the Affordable Housing Trust and to investing in building its capital reserves. As such, the town will allocate future fiscal year short-term rental revenues according to the following guidelines: 50% to the Affordable Housing Trust. And it just goes on to say what else it's done. So Brewster has stepped up, in a big way to provide the funds to the trust. And I had Tucker next. Tucker, you still there?
I am here.
You want to talk to us about Nantucket's short-term rental obligation?
Sure. Yeah, the brief history on our short-term rental, when the opportunity came through from the state to impose a local portion, our select board did vote to do the maximum 6% local. There was an article at our town meeting last year that was proposed to dedicate 2/3 of that new revenue to housing, and that it would go into a stabilization fund, which the article received a majority vote at town meeting, but not the plurality it needed in order to be enacted. And I think there was some concern, one, on overall budgetary impacts, even though, as Harry noted, this is a new revenue stream. There are a variety of issues that Nantucket is dealing with, as I'm sure all of your communities are. So there was a little concern about the level of funding being 2/3 of this revenue stream. In addition, the fact that it would go into a stabilization fund and then have to be voted out was also a little clumsy. Or cumbersome. So what has ended up happening, though, is that really led to town administration, in effect, dedicating 1/3 of this new revenue stream on an ongoing basis to the housing office here. So there is $2 million a year that has been established in the budget. That was in there last year, will be again this year. And that also, beyond simply the $2 million, authorizations for the ability to bond a large portion of that have been approved as well.
Oh, that's great. And Michelle, I know Provincetown is looking at doing that. Are you still there?
I'm still here.
Great.
Hi
Can you tell
again.
us can you tell us what's going on with the rental, short-term rental fees in your town?
So Provincetown had special legislation years ago on the room tax receipts, which have been going in a certain percentages into a tourism fund, the general fund, and a capital stabilization fund. So the recent conversations, which would require amending that special legislation, is to create a fourth bucket for housing. And the current discussion is around 26% of the overall room tax revenues, which includes the short-term receipts, which could be like 800, 900,000 a year, based on the recent estimates. The conversation is also included, where do we want it to go? Because we have two existing trust funds, the traditional affordable and the year-round market rate affordable, rental housing. And there was discussion about a stabilization fund, which I think we will not do that, just because it lacks, we already have two funds and it lacks fluidity. So that's where the conversation is now. We're also talking about the marijuana tax receipts, as some piece may or may not go towards housing as well. So we're looking at all kinds of revenue potentials for housing. So some chunk will go. And at the moment, the discussion is 26% of the overall room tax receipts.
And did Provincetown adopt 6% for the short-term rental? The full
Yes.
amount? Yes. Okay, great. Anyone else want to chime in on what your town has done or is hoping to do? No. Don't see it. Oh, there we go. Alan. What's Orleans up to?
Okay, so Harry hit on the issue of wastewater treatment as well. And Orleans is faced with about $150 million of investment in a wastewater treatment system. And currently we are underway with 60 million, and next spring we'll be adding another 30, and then there will be some others. So when the short-term rental tax came in, the town voted almost unanimously to raise from 4% to 6%, and to dedicate it to a stabilization fund to help pay for a very expensive wastewater system. So the numbers worked out that The existing hotel motel tax had been at 4. We were at, over a 5-year period, we've gotten about $234,000 a year. So raising it to 6 would project get 360 or more. The pandemic, and we had no idea, absolutely no idea what we would get under the short-term rental tax. We didn't know. So the town created a stabilization fund. Pandemic arrived, hotel motel dropped to about 50% of what it had been, and short-term rental tax took over. So that money has gone into the stabilization fund to pay for starting up the wastewater plant, which requires about $1 million before you start receiving fees, and also is set aside to pay debt service. Prior to dealing with this issue, however, I believe the town of Orleans was the first town on Cape Cod, except maybe Provincetown, to go to the voters and ask for a general override of then 1% of what was raised by the tax rate, which would have been $275,000 a year. That comes in every year from the voters. So that was a source of local funding that we did not have before. The other thing that I want to end with, and it's a question to Tucker, I have looked at CPC as a bonding technique for community housing. And we have done it in Orleans by taking a preservation restriction on the Penrose Cape Cod 5 project at the former Cape Cod 5 operations building. And we've dedicated $2 million to that. Tucker, I noticed that a couple of years ago, Nantucket raised, using CPC funds, $5 million for community housing. And I just want to know how that has worked, and how do you then pay off that debt on a project by project basis? Because there has to be something behind the debt when you ultimately float it. So when the time comes, I'd love to hear about that. Thank you.
Okay. Tucker, do you want to answer Alan's questions?
Sure, I'd be happy to try to. Thank you, Alan. Yes, so voters approved the CPC recommendation for the $5 million bonding. That money has been instrumental in our ability to acquire several different sites for housing, community housing projects, where the proportion of CPC funds going into that land acquisition will result in the same proportion of units being restricted at 100% AMI or less in accordance with the use of CPC funds. And there is a second bond for another $5 million that our CPC is recommending for our upcoming town meeting.
And Tucker, when you're paying the bond, do you pay it out of the fund that's dedicated to housing, or does it come off the top?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't answer that part of Alan's question earlier. So the CPC, when it approved doing this, it takes an annual contribution as determined in conjunction with our finance director and sets that money aside. So in our case for the $5 million bond, it was $350,000 of the annual revenue to the CPC. That is set aside from essentially the first year, and that will go to pay the debt service or initially reduce the overall amount of the required permanent bonding, because obviously we didn't go out day one and borrow $5 million.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Tucker. That was a great explanation. Harry?
Yeah, just one brief comment that I omitted from when I spoke last time. I'm not unmindful of the fact that select board policies can be ephemeral, and as the political winds change, policies can change. But we looked at this as a way to, essentially a temporary measure to demonstrate that the town had the capacity to fund housing to this level I think the end game that I would like to see is a much more permanent allocation of funding, either through a initiative petition or some other form that legally locks it in. But I wanted to demonstrate to the town that Wellfleet can support affordable housing at this level and still run the rest of its government. So that's why we chose to do a policy rather than look for some other other more permanent solution. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Harry. Betty?
Yes, Truro passed 2 articles at our last town meeting. The first one raised the short-term rental tax from 4% to 6%. The second one dedicated 1/3 of the short-term rental tax to a trust fund for community housing. And that has just been, the structure's been just approved. And that will begin soon next year. And the thing is, it does have, well, we didn't do it, but, and we think, I mean, there is one sort of problem is that every time you spend money from it, you have to go to town meeting.
So you didn't adopt a municipal affordable housing trust?
Oh, we did. Yeah.
But in the bylaws, it has to go back to town meeting. Usually they don't.
In the article.
In the article?
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, that's too bad. That
Yeah.
limits it.
we didn't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really, I mean, it's really good. They raised it and we can always change that, I guess, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, at least you got some funds.
Yeah.
Right. That's the important part. Anyone else have anything else to add on short-term rentals and the opportunity that it does give towns, for those towns who are contemplating it? I wish you well. I think it's a great use of the funds. It's a great nexus between short-term rentals and the need for additional housing. We talked about Brewster's policy. Now Tucker's going to talk to us about real estate transfer fees. I know that some of you have, some of your towns have signed on to some of the bills or supported some of the bills. But Tucker's going to talk to us about Nantucket's bill and the reasoning behind it and the process for getting it passed.
Hey, Laura. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the transfer fee. I was trying to figure out like where to start this discussion, and I think that what I may do is start actually with my testimony, which I gave to the Joint Housing Committee alongside many other folks last week. And this is where we started. This is where I started. So I said, a wise philosopher once noted, boldness has genius in it. Begin it now. I will boldly say, when it comes to the well-being of Massachusetts residents, the committee could not be considering a more impactful piece of housing legislation than H 1377/Senate 868. Nantucket and many other Commonwealth communities need this legislation now. Since 2016, Nantucket has on multiple occasions sent up a home rule petition supported by unanimous votes of town meeting to create the type of reliable revenue source for year-round housing that this current bill would provide. Sadly, during these last 5 years, since the legislation was initially submitted, The median home price on Nantucket has risen by 64% to 2.5 million today. We presently have 750 year-round households on wait lists for planned residential developments, which equates to over 5 applicants for each unit of rental housing that these developments will produce. Nantucket has been doing its part. I noted the $10 million in bonding for housing our CPC has supported. 2 million of newly minted short-term rental revenue is also going to annually support year-round housing creation. Voters have further supported debt exclusions and other bonding authorizations, contributing an additional $33 million. Beyond the dollars, I should note that even prior to the passage of Housing Choice, Nantucket allowed multifamily and ADUs by right. We have increased our subsidized housing inventory from less than 2% 3 years ago to now 5.5% and climbing. And I would like to give a special shout out to DHCD for all of their support. Yet all of this is not enough. More resources need to be brought to bear if we are concerned about retaining a resident population at all income levels. Now, it is great if some ARPA funds can go toward attainable housing in communities like Nantucket, yet those funds are limited, and we are talking about a several $100 million problem in Nantucket alone. Similarly, the HERO bill is very much welcomed, yet it will only go so far. Even if the housing portion of the bill were awarded on a pro rata basis, that equates to only $427,000 per municipality. That won't move the needle in a place like Nantucket. I quoted a philosopher earlier. Let me also quote a realist, Libby Gibson, our town manager. What keeps me up at night is how to operate the municipality with sufficient staffing levels and how to keep our employees housed in housing that is safe and secure and that they can afford. We have multiple town positions open due to lack of available housing. We had a DPW employee living out of their car recently. We currently have 4 firefighters that commute to the island when they are called on duty. If we have a large call, will there be enough people returning to help? How many firefighters respond in other towns? 30, 40, 50? According to our chief, we're lucky now to get even 12. We're going to have several department head level, deputy level, specialist level positions retiring in the next 3 to 5 years. If we do not find on-island candidates who already have housing, we're going to be looking at remote working commuting. Do we really want teachers having to make a daily commute over 30 miles of ocean? That simply isn't sustainable. And it isn't just the town. Businesses and nonprofits across the island wrestle with the same issue. Our year-round community is now eroding faster than our shores, and there is no genius in allowing that. So Nantucket has been at this effort for some time now, and we're very pleased over the course of this last year that roughly a dozen other towns have joined us with their own home rule petitions, and now this statewide enabling legislation sponsored by Representative Connolly and Senator Comerford that is an opt-in mechanism for a transfer fee, which would allow local municipalities to elect to have an up to 2% transfer fee on the portion of real estate transactions that are above the state median home price. So in Nantucket's case, we originally, our home rule petition proposed 0.5% on the amounts over $2 million in a transaction. So in a $3 million transaction, that would equate to $5,000. When the governor came down here and I was asked to meet with him about our legislation, it took him probably less than 30 seconds to say, this is a rounding error. And I said, exactly, this is negotiated away without people even thinking about it every day. But it would make a big difference in a place like Nantucket. If this had been in place over the course of the last couple of years, we would have generated $5 to $10 million annually toward the housing effort. So we've said for a long time in Nantucket, you know, there isn't one silver bullet. There isn't one magic solution. We're going to need a dozen different solutions. And this is we view a critical part in getting this done.
Thanks, Tucker. I know that there's other folks who from towns that have joined in a coalition to support real estate transfer fees. And I'd love to hear from folks, their positions on it and what, if they've done the kinds of work that Nantucket has done to kind of estimate what that would have brought in for housing in your community. I'm sorry, I can't see folks, so if you would like to speak, in the react on the bottom of your screen, there's reactions and there's a raise hand option. Great, Carolyn.
Yeah, hello. So from Chatham, so we have one of the towns that have our own petition for the transfer tax. And I just want to add, I don't have a lot of raw data on our stats, but one of the things that most impressed me was it passed overwhelming at town meeting to send this up at the home rule petition. And we also had endorsement from our summer advisory residents, summer resident advisory committee, who would, you would think that would be the demographic that would be against it, and they wholeheartedly supported it, basically because they understand the phenomenon. It's, you know, they'll pay the dollars to maintain the quality of life here in Chatham, which is what they love. It's their second home. It really is their home, and they love the community. So they understand in real terms. And the other thing I noticed was when I was sitting at the Senate hearing, waiting for all the people to chat across the state, how widespread it was. You know, we're here in Chatham. It's similar to Nantucket and the Outer Cape, where we're a resort community, we're isolated, and we have all those types of problems that makes this issue even worse. But you have it in urban areas, you have it in rural areas, it's all across the state, and it's like completely metastasized everywhere. And we need to look at this housing dilemma as a new problem, and you need new solutions. We can't constantly try to fit our situation to these old antiquated ideas of how to deal with affordable housing when we're really on the brink of losing our year-round residents and becoming this resort community across the state almost. So I was very impressed with how widespread it was, and very happy to see all the different communities advocating for the need. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Carolyn, do you know what the details of your home rule petition, what the transfer fee would be?
Yeah, it's 0.5% for sales over $2 million, I believe.
Okay.
So, and again, that passed wholeheartedly, and I hope it goes through.
That's great. That's terrific. Anyone else want to chime in? Nobody?
Or I guess I just want to direct people to the link that I posted in the chat to the coalition that you mentioned.
Thanks. I just saw that. All right. Oh, Alan.
Yeah, I have been following this, and I wanted to just note that as Tucker talked, he talked about a larger bill that had been submitted by representatives and senators. I forget the names. And it made me think back to the time where 15 years ago, there were some towns on the Cape that were trying to tax short-term rentals. It wasn't, and Provincetown and Brewster particularly, as I remember, would have put in home rule petitions every year. And they go and they have a hearing and they just fall in the hopper because people up in Beacon Hill, although most of them come here for the summer, don't care about our financial problems because, quote, we're rich. And it wasn't in the case of the short-term rental tax, it didn't get traction until Representative Minkowitz in Boston all of a sudden was overwhelmed with Airbnb actions that were taking away the housing of his constituents. And I think he ultimately chaired a special committee that toured the state to understand what was really happening with short-term rentals, driven particularly by Airbnb at the time. And when it finally got to that level, people on the Cape Cod, I was involved with Andrew Gottlieb and Wendy Norcross and Rich Delaney and former Senator Leary, could go up to the State House and people began to understand that this was a new tax that could solve a problem that was created by the cause of the program. And then it got to the point where the big cities began to understand this was an issue that impacted them as well. And that's when it got traction. So, Provincetown and Chatham and Nantucket and a few others can file bills, but until we get the whole state jumping on this with key legislators, the chances of success are not very high. That's just based on my own experience and watching it play out in the short-term rental tax. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I will say that I think, I'm optimistic this year. There seems to be a much broader coalition, and legislatures seem to be listening because it isn't just, wealthy towns. It's pretty much across the board, except for some, maybe gateway cities. Tucker, you wanted to add?
I just was going to quickly, I agree 100% with everything Alan just said. And fortunately, I think Micklewitz is starting to pay attention to this as well.
Okay. Good, that would be a great supporter. All right, anything else on the real estate transfer tax? All right, then we'll move on. What other local funds for community housing? As Alan had alluded to, the general fund allocation or bonding. Several towns, and I included Orleans, even though that was not really, I guess it wasn't really a general fund, it was a bonding, have allocated money from their general fund to the trust, to their trust. Dedicated revenue from leases. For example, I know in Harwich, they have some funds that are dedicated from a cell tower lease. And with the proliferation of solar farms on town-owned land, it would, if they are leased out, there may be some room there to get some revenue. Donations. I would caution on the donations that a trust can solicit donations because they can accept donations, so they can solicit donations. The caveat is that they have to report who they solicit. So if you do a general mailing, you kind of just have to have recorded who it goes to. Otherwise, it is fine. And donations can be both in the form of funds, which is kind of what we're talking about here, but also, as Chatham said, it can be land, it can be buildings, it can be not a donation. You can solicit using the Central Register and Public Legal Notices your desire to purchase land or buildings for affordable housing. And that's how Chatham got to their latest acquisition, or soon to be acquisition, fingers crossed. So now we just wanted to have some discussions about kind of everything that we've been talking about. What other ideas do folks have for funding? What's the next best thing that's coming forward? We certainly have the once in a generation opportunity with some federal funds, but how do we unlock them for the type of housing that we're talking about? And I'm just going to keep reading these down, and you can answer whichever as we go. What does the conversation sound like in your town about using local resources to create community housing? From what I've been hearing, there seems to be overwhelming support, but I'd like to hear details of what that support could be, and which unrestricted funding source could have the greatest impact in your town's ability to create more community housing. And finally, what are the barriers you see to unlocking the potential? Hi, Gary, nice to see you. You
Nice to
wanna-
see you, Laura. I had two questions.
Sure.
We have been looking at doing online donations into the town. Is any other town doing that now for housing?
Not that I know of. Is it to the town or to the trust?
Well, that's actually your last slide made me think that maybe it should go to the town and not to the town for housing rather than to the trust for housing.
No, if it goes to the town, I believe it would be restricted to go to the general fund for donations, or it would have to go through a approval process. If it goes to the trust, then you just have to maintain records of who's been solicited and who's made donations.
But if you have a general, online ability to make donations, and we have people that are interested, how do we identify that outreach, other than to say the entire town?
That's what you say.
Okay. And I have a second question. Is there any effort to increase the CPA limit above 100%?
So the only one that I know of is Chatham's home rule petition, which is asked just specifically for Chatham to increase it to 200%.
So the only way you could increase it above 100% is via a home rule petition for your particular town. There's no effort statewide to increase that.
I have not heard of one, but there may be, but I haven't heard of one.
Thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the donations question from Gary. The Orleans Affordable Housing Trust has received unsolicited donations annually, and they have been anonymous. So they come in, the treasurer knows who they are, and I, as chairman, I see it. But I think that it's something that trusts could do. If the word gets out that the trust, and as a matter of fact, we have someone who has approached us and is working on her residue ultimately from her estate. So there are things out there that can happen over time, as they happened with land in the earlier days of Cape Cod. So getting the message out that the trusts are real, they're tax deductible, and they're doing things that make a big difference might lead to some surprises. And I just want to go back to community housing and CPA for a minute. And it's something that we've talked about a little bit. Tucker raised it and I raised it about bonding CP money. As I looked at the history of CPA across the state, there have only been 16 instances where towns have bonded money to pay for a share of an affordable housing project. And only one instance so far through May 13th last year, where a community did what Nantucket did, which was go to the community town meeting, get a bond authorization, get it approved, and then as projects came along, the trust could fund them with that CPA money, and ultimately it becomes paid off by the CPA annual budget. And that's exactly the way it happened with the predecessor to CPA, the land bank.
Yes.
That Laura, you were here, from 1999 to 2005, the Cape communities went wild buying land to preserve this community, and it was all bonded. So I was on, ironically, I was on the transition from land bank at Orleans to CPA, and I saw what happened when we finally got the CPA. All the local money that was appropriated annually in 2005 went to the debt service for the land that had been acquired. And the CPA provided new state matching funds. So the debt has gradually gone down annually. But we need to think that as we move into the housing crisis, let's think about using the debt capacity of our CPA. And it's a way to rethink, because historically, those of you that have been involved in CPA who weren't involved in the land bank, just look at the annual budget. Okay, we got $1 million. How are we going to spend it? Let's think about how we can leverage that money through debt at beautiful interest rates to achieve what we want to do. And that
Right.
requires rethinking.
Exactly. And I think you were involved a number of years ago when Bob Murray tried to get towns to bond for affordable housing. He was looking for $5 million from each town. Nobody was willing to do it back then, but that was probably 15 years ago anyway. But of course, the attraction of bonding now is at such low interest rates that it really makes sense to think about it. So thanks for your,
Yeah.
Go ahead,
and just
Alan.
one other thing to remember,
Yeah.
unlike any other bond issue, I believe I can say this, most bond issues, I'll say, this does not increase anybody's tax bill when you bond it through CPC,
right,
already covered by the surtax. People say, well, let's just go to the voters instead. Well, you go to the voters and the taxpayer is going to have to pay for it through a debt exclusion. That doesn't happen in CPC. So the money's there. Let's figure out how to use it. Thank you.
right. And there, of course, the restrictions of CPA are the deed restrictions and the income limitations. But it certainly can go a long way towards contributing to the housing crisis and a range of incomes. Carolyn, I see your hand up again.
Yeah, hello. I just
Yeah,
had
hi.
a technical question about the CPC funding. So
Sure.
as you know, we have a home rule petition up trying to kick that up to 200%. But outside of that, my understanding is you got your buckets that the CPC funds, 10% goes in each, and then there's a bucket of money left over that each town gets each year can be allocated to a different thing. So my question is, if that 10% has to be traditional capital A, that stays capital A, is that extra money that could be allocated to something, is that bound by the same capital A rule?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, any community preservation, if it's for community housing, it has to be within the same rules, and the same as if CPA money is given to the trust, the regulations follow and the restrictions follow.
okay, all right.
So the trust has to do it. Thanks for the question. Tucker?
I just was going to say, in regard to Gary's question about online donations, we have also here, we're in the process of establishing a community land trust that we're viewing as a public-private enterprise. And so we have set up a fund at our local community foundation specifically for that purpose, and donations are being directed to that and can be taken online.
Awesome, great. Great thoughts. Jay?
Thanks, Laura. I just wanted to offer that I think this has been a really important discussion, and certainly one of the great challenges that we have on the lower and outer Cape is the lack of affordability for people above 80% of area median income. And, you know, it has been challenging too to figure out how to finance those units, because most of the federal and state funding, as we've talked about today, is for 80% and below. And the short-term rental tax resources that are now available, the ability for CPC to go up to 100% of AMI is really helpful. The prospect too of a real estate transfer tax, I think, is really promising, as is the, you know, what's been done with just using free cash to fund housing trusts and not having restraints there. But I'm a little worried about raising the CPC cap to 200% of AMI, and here's why. We still have tremendous need in our communities for people who earn less than $30,000 a year. And in fact, Ted Malone, who is the owner of Community Housing Resource and close to 90 units of affordable housing in Wellfleet, Truro, and Provincetown, recently did a lottery to establish a centralized wait list for his portfolio. Michelle, Jurashevich, correct me if I'm wrong with these figures, because I'm doing it off the top of my head, but I believe that there were over 200 families who applied for that lottery. And that 60% of those families are earning less than $30,000 a year. So, yes, we definitely have need and we need to address it, but this is a real balancing act too. And so let's not put everything into the community housing bucket, and let us remember that that there's, and that, when DHCD considers a funding for a project, only 13% of the units have to be at 30% of AMI and below. And the only way for those projects to work is for there to be a rental voucher attached to them, so that you can make up the difference between what the family can pay in rent and what the actual rent cost is of running that property. And then also keep in mind that when we get up to above 100% of AMI, we're starting to talk about rents that are easily covering the yearly operational costs and can actually finance some debt in a project. So let's not forget let's not throw every single resource into the above 80% of AMI, and remember that we need to serve the whole breadth of needs in our communities.
Absolutely. And that's why, when we talk about community housing, I like to think of it as a whole range of housing, the whole range, including affordable housing, including so-called workforce housing, including the workforce that we really have, and also those folks that are not in the workforce. We didn't talk about that as another one of my pet peeves on the term workforce, is that there's a lot of folks who are not in the workforce for various reasons, and they shouldn't be left out of the picture either. So we really need to think about everyone in a community and all the ranges from 0 to beyond in who we can serve. Andrea?
Hi, thanks,
Hi.
Laura. I want to raise a kind of wraparound point, because I think that there's a psychology to this, knowing the history in Wellfleet about who really paid for Preservation Hall. And it was primarily the non-resident homeowners in Wellfleet who raised the most of the money to build that. And I had a shocking conversation recently with another summer resident of Orleans who was upset that she didn't realize how profoundly horrible the housing situation was. And I think that if we build this ethic of recognizing the way people support open space and contribute to land trusts, if we engage the summer residents in a way that they can take action, I think it's really important when you see a project that's so big that we pursue all of the federal and state relief and create the new mechanisms like the transfer tax. But I also think that opening up the idea of a contribution of an actual home or land or money, or mention us in your estate, giving people a venue to take action within their own lives to help solve a problem that we've fully mapped. And we invite we invite the whole community in. I know we've talked about this in the Orleans Trust, but I think and CDP has done groundbreaking work of telling the story. I think we have to keep at that. And then the result would be, when we go to town meeting, if people are conscious of the problem, they're more likely to support the kind of government answers because they've already taken a small action themselves.
Terrific. Great. Alan?
Yeah, I hate to come back, but this is a great conversation. And Jay and you have sort of made me think about something else here that I want to toss out. As funders, so trust and community, we give money to developers to create affordable housing. And we get a preservation, a housing restriction or something like that in return. But because we're coming to the table with money, we have the ability to negotiate other things that we want. So think about a case where somebody is coming in with a rental project and the requirement is 25% of those units be affordable and 75% can be market. And that developer wants help from us. So why can't we go to that developer and say, we're going to focus all of our input on the 25% side of that project, and in exchange, X% of those units at 75 are going to be deed restricted to people at 100 to 130% of AMI. Now, that's a deal. We're coming to the table with money, just like a banker, and we can then get, by using our local community preservation money or other money, focusing it at the lower end, but in exchange, we get something that we can't finance ourselves, but the developer could. And as Jay said, when you begin to get up higher, the developer's market rents can begin to carry the debt anyways. So I think we need to think about financing techniques like that to cover the areas that we cannot normally fund with the money that we get to use. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Also, for those communities who do have private developers coming in to do affordable projects, if you don't have inclusionary zoning to get some affordable units, and even if you do, the opportunities to engage and negotiate to buy down some of the market units is also less expensive than creating a new unit, and can, really small steps incrementally increase the availability of year-round housing, if not year-round affordable housing. Obviously, if you're using community preservation funds, it would have to be under 100% of median income. But even if you had the 100% versus 80 or 65 or 60, which is some of the inclusionary requirements, you can then start, in small steps. And sometimes, we have to take our wins where we get them. But every little piece of every unit counts, every home counts. So we still have some time, so I want to open it up to questions. Any thoughts on barriers? We've had a lot of really great discussion around the positive things that are happening. I hate to end it on a negative or to move into a negative thing, but are there barriers that we can work on? Are there barriers that we can advocate to remove? I had mentioned the barrier to the workforce housing market eligibility that Jay chimed in on, but are there other things that you see in your community that have been a barrier to either increasing funding or even just the development of new housing? We all know that the typical opposition is not about housing, of course. It's about every other issue that the town has, including, wastewater and water infrastructure is a serious problem. It's not only, it usually is solvable. So what do you see in your community? Anyone want to chime in on what barriers we can be working on? Ward? Oh, can't, you have to unmute.
How about that?
That's great.
Okay, thanks. I see a barrier that we could work on, and maybe there's ways to work on it jointly, is to look at ways to fund and collaborate on community engagement. I was thinking of Andrea Shaw Reed's comments about how if donors, people are given chances to donate, they would be more supportive at town meeting. We go to town meeting biting our nails and sometimes over pennies. And so I think that more professional support for community engagement strategies would be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Elaine?
I just think that over the past 2 years, we've seen a sea change in what is going on. And I think recognizing it, being able to bring it forward to people through community engagement and things like that is really important, to recognize the huge change that has happened and to get a little control over it, to keep our communities viable. And this has nothing to do with funding, but I know one of our biggest barriers in Wellfleet is zoning. And I know that there's going to be some educational stuff about the history of land use policies on the Cape, but I think for people to understand what that has created is an important piece of it.
Thanks. I agree with you. And I will tell you that my team, has a couple of planners, and we have been working directly with communities to help them look at their zoning and also make recommendations to change some zoning to be more inclusive. And so, if folks have specific questions or needs, please reach out. We can provide some help, hopefully, at least in putting something together that could then be debated within the town. Andrea, are you there? I'm sure you're there.
Right here.
Can you talk about the CHAPA's Municipal Engagement Initiative and how that may, your work with them and how it may impact the towns with community engagement?
Yeah, definitely. So CHAPA has a municipal engagement initiative team of 3 people now, and they have kind of 2 different paths that towns can take to support their community engagement activities in their town. It's really a coalition building effort. The formal program, the Municipal Engagement Initiative, is an application-based process where towns can apply to CHAPA to get this support, and then they are or are not selected. And CHAPA will come in and help them identify leaders in the community, develop leaders in the community, and launch a housing-focused coalition at the town level, facilitate the launch meeting, and really do a lot of hand-holding through the process of getting a broad coalition of people in the town to be advancing housing production. And it's interesting because even though it is broader housing advocacy, it's very much framed around, at least initially, the town's housing priorities, so that it kind of like builds in that alignment. Sometimes coalitions can go in a separate direction, which is a great thing down the road, but in the beginning, it's good to be on firm ground. And then I think over time, the municipal leaders that are part of that process do kind of step back. And if all goes well, the coalition takes a life of its own. What we've been doing with CHAPA to support our housing advocacy efforts as part of our broader Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership program is that we are doing bringing an MEI light version to the towns that are interested. So if you go on CHAPA's website, you can look at their municipal engagement initiative, and there's an MEI light toolkit, which really lays out exactly what the effort entails. But basically, for towns that are interested, they can kind of bypass the application process to do a less intense version of the program by partnering with us, and we'll provide some staffing support. And CHAPA will, again, do like that beginning piece, help identify who the community leaders are, put together a launch meeting for a housing coalition, and then provide a lot of support, particularly around messaging, which tends to be what people need the most help around. But these coalitions can be focused on really whatever is of interest to the town. It can be around a specific housing development. It can be around broad awareness raising with regard to housing needs. It could be around a planning process. It could be around, bringing a new funding stream to support housing production in the town. It can be whatever is of interest to the town. So that option is available to Lower Cape communities that want to work with us and CHAPA without applying to the bigger program.
Thanks. That was great. All right, I am going to leave you with my contact information. It is on our website, mhp.net, if you need it or want it. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to talk about wrap up and other things. And if there's time, I'll come back.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Laura. We always love working with you on these workshops, and I know that this topic was a long time coming and of interest to a lot of folks. I also want to thank Michelle, Harry, Katie, and Tucker for sharing what's going on in your communities. Just to kind of wrap it up with a bow, I guess what I'm hearing is that towns really need to be using the full slate of local resources at their disposal in order to address our need for community housing at a variety of income levels. The short-term rental tax is available to us right now, so the CDP does strongly advocate for towns to maximize their allocation of short-term rental revenues to housing development and infrastructure. And we'd be happy to work with towns to think through a strategy to accomplish that or to increase their allocation if you've already started. I want to let you all know that as a follow-up to this workshop, we'll be extending this conversation in our winter Lower and Outer Cape peer group meetings this mid-December, where CHAPA will be joining us to facilitate a discussion. For those of you who haven't been a part of our peer group meetings before, this is an informal space for municipal officials and town staff to share learning, successes, challenges, what's going on in their community around housing production and housing initiatives. And like I said, this particular upcoming meeting will be focused on funding for community housing and particularly how to talk about it and kind of sell it to your community, whether it's within town hall or your broader community at large. I also want to let you know that our next workshop in the Lower Cape Housing Institute is going to be in January, on January 21st. Again, we're working with Laura. And just to give you a little bit of a taste of what that's going to be about, the workshop is called Community by Design. It's going to focus on the aesthetic side of housing development. We understand that we can't build our way out of the housing crisis without intensifying density. And discussing density can be a major barrier at the local level to getting the scale that we need to solve the problem. So in this workshop, we'll be redirecting the density conversation to the importance of good design. We're in a special moment right now where 4 towns have acquired large parcels of land that can include housing components. So we hope that this workshop will help our communities articulate bold visions for those land opportunities by kind of opening our eyes to the possibilities of beautiful, affordable housing design. So you can sign up for that on our website right now, but we do strongly encourage you to sign up for our monthly Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership e-newsletter for a monthly rundown of all things Lower Cape housing and certainly details about our upcoming events. Let's see, what else did I want to say? I think that was it. Just a reminder that we'll be sharing some follow-up materials after this, including a link to the recording in our YouTube channel. And Laura, did you have some final thoughts you wanted to share with us before we end?
I have a couple of coming attractions. Just some things that may or may not, at least in the works. The county, Barnstable County is looking at establishing a shared service office, housing service office. The idea right now is 1 full-time employee that would take over servicing, monitoring of affordable units with a la carte menu for other services that towns could weigh in on. Again, this is just in the beginning stages. All of the towns have a representative to the County Home Consortium Advisory Board, and it's been discussed there. So hopefully it's being discussed in your community through your representative from the Home Consortium. Basically looking to get some input on what services you might want and whether this is something that towns do want to see. So it's not a baked yet. It's just an idea. The town of Barnstable, hoping to get others to join in, has been working with my colleagues at MHP's homeownership to establish a 1+ Barnstable or 1+ Cape program. Our one mortgage, I alluded to it being the most affordable. 1+ has been piloted in Boston, where the interest rate of the mortgage is reduced by 1% using CPA funds. So for folks up to 100% of AMI, this makes a big difference in the mortgage payments. For very little output for CPA, it's about $40,000 per mortgage. There's also down payment assistance, and for a total subsidy of between $75,000 and $100,000, you can get first-time homebuyers into homes. And that's in Boston that we've been doing it. In Boston, 1+ Boston targets first-generation homebuyers and households of color and all underserved populations. And lastly, my colleagues and I have been working to come up with a safe harbor, a clear path to developing public lands without the threat of a bid protest. And that's to be continued, but it's ongoing work that I just wanted you to know. Those of you who are working to develop public land, we've talked about the issue if I'm working with you, and looking to find a solution and reach consensus with the Attorney General's office. So that's all that I had. Thank you all for being here and for participating. This has been a great session for me to facilitate. It's rather be in person, but this was, and see all your faces, but nice to see a few of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to everyone for your engagement and your good questions. We're going to sign off now and hope you have a great day and see you in January and December.
Thanks.